And APB, American Protection Bureau, voted #1 best on Long Island for all your security needs. Call 631-390-9050. That's 631-390-9050. APB. The Monty and the Pharaoh Show is brought to you by...
Because wine is your second favorite four-letter word. California wine, New York attitude. Good fucking wine.
Yeah.
We made it happen. Jimmy was an incredible success. I don't know where he is. I gotta find him. Gosh, I don't... Oh!
Oh, yeah, George. Oh, George.
Right
George.
here. Yeah.
We did it, brother.
Yes, we
hey,
did.
Thanks to Dan. You know what? And in the ring with Dan and Benny. Hey, brother, man, he's about the most cat. I just love him to death. I love you. Thanks for having me. Hey, you're the best. I'm telling you, brother. In the ring with
Dan and Benny.
Yeah.
We love you. Thank you so much.
Dan.
Mwah.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Dan and Benny in the Ring. I'm Dan Spaciano, joined as always by the original Long Island Iced B himself, Benny Scala. Benny, how you doing, buddy?
Dan, it's second time this week, 2 days ago. So I think, and as you know, my ongoing contract renegotiation. So this is just going to add some more money to my pay packet, as they said in Willy Wonka.
Right. Well, when as long as you don't get the what did they call it, the future endeavor, you should be okay.
Yeah, the FE.
Well, like you said, we're recording this on a Thursday, so we're gonna have a lot of fun. We got a lot of good stories to go over, a great story to tell from our guest. Benny, why don't you tell everybody who the third man in the picture is tonight?
Well, this gentleman's been with us so many times that I had to consult with our accounting firm of I think it's Haskins and Sells.
Oh, it's not Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
Well,
anymore?
yeah, I think maybe that's who it was. But just to see how many times he's been on the show, but he's always welcome, and it's always a great time. And the author of Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors, the professor emeritus of wrestling, George Shire. George, welcome back to Dan and Benny in the Ring.
Thank you, Benny. You know, I thought about the emeritus thing, and I think that means you've passed on. I don't know. But thank you. I've never
That'd
been
be the
called,
posthumous professor.
the only one that ever really called me professor, when I think about it, was my great grandmother, sweet little Czechoslovakian lady who was, I think if she was 5 foot tall, that was exaggerating. She always had a kerchief on her head and the long sack dress. I mean, this was many years ago, you know. She came from the old country. Man, she'd go off in this Slavic language and I wouldn't understand the things she said, but she was the sweetest lady. And when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, she called me professor. So maybe I really am.
See?
Good to be on with you guys. What are we going to do?
Well, with the plan, we always start, whenever we have guests on, we always start with the same question about, you know, we always say it's like, because the snowflake, because everyone is different, everyone's answer is unique. And Benny and I got to talking, and we had pitched some ideas to you. The first question we always start with is about how you got into wrestling, when you became a fan, when you transitioned from fan to working. And that got us thinking that, you know, we've had you on the show so many times. We've talked topics, we've talked panels, we've had you as part of a group discussion, but we've never gotten your story. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to hear your story. So we'll start with the obvious. What was it that got you into wrestling and to become a fan in the first place?
Here's a story of a man named
Nice.
Brady. You know, it's interesting when you ask that, because I know so many people that are my age, and I'm going to be 72 in a month, folks. Benny told me he's 68, so I got 4 years on him. And he revealed your age too. You could be my kid, Dan. Anyway,
Actually, I'm the one who's 40, really. But
one of the things that has always kind of intrigued me is when you ask an older wrestling fan, how did you become a fan? What attracted you? And the thing that's always amazed me is most of the people will say it just came about by accident. And there's various stories, and they'll tell it. And for me, it was weird when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, 6 and 7. I remember going to a couple of wrestling cards with my dad. And my dad wasn't really a fan. So that always confused me. But he liked Vern Gagne, I found out later. Vern Gagne was, for those that don't know, Vern was the epitome of the baby face, the mom's apple pie, good guy. Everybody loved him. And he was a scientific wrestler, whatever that meant, And so that's what I had found out. But here's what really happened. My parents, seriously, guys, I had a very turbulent childhood. And it would take much longer than this show could ever go for me to share the horrific parts of it. But to make the long story short, by the time I was 8 years old, my parents, having come back together for 2 or 3 times of being separated, they were in the kitchen fighting, and I mean arguing with one another. And this was obviously going to be the last time we were going to listen to those fights. But my little ears, I wandered into our living room and I turned on the TV. And on TV, and people have heard me tell this part, on TV was something called All-Star Wrestling. And at that moment I turned it on, it was Tiny Mills, who was a big 6'8", longer black hair, greasy hair at the time. For the late 1950s, this would have been, really unheard of. And King of the Lumberjacks, he was billed as. And his partner was Stan Crusher with a K, Kowalski, Stan Crusher Kowalski. And they literally were in the ring just pounding some guy on the TV, the double teaming. And I just sat there and I kind of tuned out the main event that was going on in the kitchen. And I was just enamored with it. And so that was part of it. It was about a week later, well, maybe a couple weeks, I was staying at my grandma's house, my dad's mom. And we used to walk down to the corner drugstore, which was about 4 blocks from her house. And they had one of the old soda fountains in there. If you guys can even recall this,
I do.
But you'd go in, they had a soda fountain, you get the big malt in the tin cup and the glass. Yeah. And so I went down there with my grandma. And when I walked in the store, I want to say it was just by fate. There was a wrestling magazine on the newsstand. And it just bounced out at me. On the cover was Eddie and Jerry Graham. And I didn't understand at the time the significance of this, but it was the very first issue of Wrestling Review magazine. It said fall issue, premiere issue. And I asked my grandma, I looked at it real quick and, they had wrestlers in it. So I asked my grandma, I said, can I have 50 cents, Grandma? And I remember her telling me, she says, well, that's a lot of money. I said, but please. And I got the 50 cents. So I think those 2 incidences were what started the addiction. And I still have the magazine. My parents got divorced. And that's when more of the turmoil in my childhood went on, because we had, it was a mess with the kids. I was the oldest, and the oldest of 6 kids at the time. I was 8. And my mother was pregnant with one while this happened. Wasn't my dad's. That was part of the problem. One of the kids that was supposedly my dad's wasn't his. It was just a mess. So you can kind of see where all of the turmoil was. Well, the bottom line is that my mother didn't want us. Literally, she told us she didn't want us. And we got beat around a lot. In today's world, I think she'd probably be in jail for some of the things that she did. I mean, we got hit with sticks and belts and spent time sleeping on the floor in the closet with no food, and it would go on for days. You know, that's just the way it was. So story goes, the court said that my dad had to take the kids. They got divorced, and he had to take the kids that were his. And it was me, my two sisters, and a little brother. The little brother was actually in children's hospital, suffering from malnutrition. He was 2 years old, and gives you a hint again to what my mother was going through. So anyway, long story short, my dad didn't have a place for us. He didn't have a house. He didn't have any place. He was living in a room, renting a room of a person that owned a house, one of the people he worked with. And so he had no place for kids. So we all ended up going to different foster homes. And I ended up being in foster homes, 3 different foster homes over a course of a 3-year period going forward. And this is where the wrestling continued to be my friend. I continued to talk my dad into buying me the latest wrestling review or the wrestling world. Bless his heart, he took me to a few cards over that 3-year period. And then I'd be in the foster home. And I was in the foster homes. The only thing that I can say that was weird about it is that I never felt welcome. I was in someone else's family. And a couple of them, there were kids there that teased me. They were a little bit older. They didn't want me there. I understood it. I was invading their territory. You know, it was just, so it wasn't good. And that's where the wrestling kind of became something that I would just look at the programs that I got from the matches, or I'd look at the magazine and I'd look at them over and over. And so that's how small it started. But once I finally got with my dad when he bought a home in 3 years later and had the four of us come together, I ended up being the babysitter. I was 12 years old. My dad worked 2 jobs, go to one, come home and go to the other. We never saw him. So the reality was that he gave us a home or a house a roof over our head, but it wasn't really a family because he wasn't there. We didn't have a mother, and we pretty much were on our own. And I had sisters, you know, the others were a year, 2 years, and 6 years younger than me. And I became the babysitter, and I didn't like the role, and I was kind of in charge. So I suppose from a logic standpoint, I could have become a bitter, delinquent person, you know, lashing out. I think I would have had reason to, I don't know. But it was always wrestling that I could watch on television. And we had wrestling on 2 days a week in those days. It was Saturday nights and Monday nights. And again, when he could, my dad, I'd beg him, could we go to the St. Paul Auditorium? Could we go to the Minneapolis Auditorium? Oddly enough, he took me to Minneapolis more times than St. Paul, and I didn't understand that because St. Paul was closer and more convenient to get to from where we lived. But anyway, that's really what started it, guys. The addiction that I could just release myself into wrestling. And the hard part is I'll be honest, and I have not told this to too many people in my life. When I was going to school, word got out that we didn't have a mother in the house, which was very not normal for the 60s. You know, usually if parents got divorced, the kids stayed with mom. Well, this was the reverse, and we had no mother. And some of the kids in school, they found out about that. There were a couple of kids, they as kids will do, they picked on me. One was older than me, a grade older, and they picked on me. And one of them, it hurt me at the time when he said it, because he said, "Shire, you're so ugly, even your mother didn't want you." And you know, when you tell that to a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, yeah, it stung. You know, it really, you didn't do anything to this guy, but yet he was being mean to you. And so, yeah, I became very shy. I admit I withdrew. I had a very ugly 7th grade. was the first year at junior high. And I think that was my rebellious year. I didn't go to school when I should be. I missed something like 67 and a half days of school.
Oh, wow.
For the school year. And I got so far behind in my schoolwork that I was getting D's. I got F's, but I got mostly D's. I didn't turn homework in. I just didn't do it. And this is where the turning point came. And actually, I'm kind of enjoying telling this because I don't really talk about this. When time for 7th grade to end came, I had been so far behind in my work that technically I shouldn't have passed. I was a bad kid. And this is where I learned a very valuable lesson, and I've carried this with me my whole life, because I think people come into our lives and I look at role models, and most people think of a role model is somebody special, somebody who does great things, and somebody who's famous. And I have role models that have been bad people, and I've learned from them.
Learn what not to do.
So with backing up, with my mother being the way she was, and let me just state this. I have long ago forgiven my mother. She has passed on, and I have no malice towards her at all. I've tried to rationalize in my head that she just wasn't capable of dealing with all the kids and everything that happened, and she was 29 years old when all this was going on. I've just left it that way and said, I got to move on. But here's what happened in 7th grade. I shouldn't have passed. And the principal called me into his office, and I can almost hear him telling me this. He says, Shire, you should not even pass. He said, I don't believe for 1 minute that you were sick, that you missed school because of illness. He said, I think you just goofed off. And he says, quite honestly, you're a loser. He's telling me this is the principal. Now, I think today they'd probably do, you wouldn't be able to do that either in today's PC world. I don't know.
No, he'd be fired.
Exactly. It'd be a lawsuit. But he did this. He said, you're a loser. And here's where the role model thing comes in, and the lesson. He made me mad. And I was mad in a different way, though. I'm listening to him. And when I walked out of his office, and I passed, I went on to 8th grade. But for most of the summer, I was just simmering. What a jerk, I'm thinking in my mind he was. What an idiot. And I wanted to get even with him. This is a 14-year-old mindset. I wanted to get even with him. And I came up with a perfect plan. I'm going to get even with him. I'm going to go to school every single day next year. And I'm going to do all my homework. And I'm going to do my work. Okay, I was going to get even with him. Well, here's the deal. I started my perfect attendance route. And a minute ago, I mentioned my Czechoslovakian great-grandmother to you. In October, the middle of October of the 8th grade year, and so we're about a month and a half into the school year, my great-grandma dies. And I loved her so much. She was just very special. And her funeral was off 100 miles away, and I wanted to go, but I sacrificed it. I said, I can't, because I was still going to get even with Mr. Corliss, the principal. I'm going to show him. So I went to school. End of the school year, here's the deal, guys. To show him and teach him a lesson, I didn't get a lot of A's, but I got B's and C's. A lot of B's. I was on the B honor roll for a while.
Big improvement, though.
And I had perfect attendance. So at the end of the school year, now I'm going to get even with him. So I go back over to his office, and I have my perfect attendance certificate. And I I said to him, I said, Mr. Corliss, I wonder if you'd sign this for me. And he looked at me, and I swear to you guys, and I was petrified when I did this, but I thought I was teaching him a lesson. He looked at me and he said, I am so proud of what you have done.
Wow.
And he said, it would be an honor for me to sign. And he turned my certificate over and he wrote on there that I had achieved this monumental accomplishment and that he was very proud of me and wished me continued success. And I walked out of there and I thought, what happened? You know? And so I bring that story up and like I say, I don't share it. I even got a little tear. I don't bring it up hardly ever, but that was a lesson. He was a role model and he taught me that being punctual, being on time, being there, attendance is important, doing your work is important. Well, here's the moral of the story. 9th grade came, perfect attendance, went back to Mr. Corliss, had him sign my certificate. 10th grade came along, and I'm telling you the truth, perfect attendance, went back, had him sign my certificate. Junior year, 11th grade, same thing.
Wow.
I get to my senior year. It was the month of April in my senior year, 2 months away from graduation. Perfect attendance. I got pneumonia. I was in the hospital for 2 days, literally during the school week. I missed 2 days of school. I beat myself up. I thought, oh my God. The end of the school year came and I had finished out the school year with just those 2 days. I graduated. I went back to Mr. Corliss and I told him, I said, I can't come with a certificate this year. I said, you know what? I got sick in April. And he looked at me and he said, he always just called you by your last name. I think it was just his thing because I knew he did it with other kids too. He said, Shire, don't beat yourself up. He said, you have already made the point that you are going to try to succeed. And he said, I can't say how proud I am of you. Now, here's the deal. When I walked away from all of these, then 5 years of schooling, I never really knew if Mr. Corliss had intended that to be the case when he called me a loser, or if he had given up on me and I surprised him after all. I don't know. But the bottom line was I thought a good thing came of it. And so that was a lesson that I carried with me all through my work life. I thought that going to work, yeah, when you're sick, stay home. I mean, I didn't have perfect attendance at work my whole life. I'm not saying that. But it was important to be on time to appointments, to meetings, whatever it is. And I learned that valuable lesson from Mr. Corliss. But here's the bottom line. Let's get back to wrestling. What the hell? All my junior high years, I followed wrestling. I didn't like the role I had at home. So wrestling became more and more my thing. And I was kind of a recluse. I saved my magazines. I wouldn't let people touch them. I had one neighbor that borrowed one time and it came back looking like the dog used it for you know, and then he called me a loser because I got mad at him for wrecking my magazine.
Oh, geez.
I mean, so I told him, I said, well, it's my magazine. You don't understand. So you're never going to borrow another one. You know, it's that simple. But I started protecting my things, and being in the environment I was in, it was important for me to always protect my collection. So my wrestling collection was my magazine collection at the time, and I had programs. But then I came up with this idea to start trading programs with other people in different territories. And one of the magazines had pen pal sections. It was a long shot. You know, you write an anonymous letter to some picture in a magazine and you say, you know, I'd like to get your program and I'll send you my program, you know, I'll show you yours if you show me yours.
Right.
You know, that old game.
Right.
But I ended up coming up with a network of fans here and there. Some of them changed, some fell by the wayside. They weren't long-term fans or anything, but I got my license. This was the key. I got my driver's license in 1967, and the only reason I wanted to get my driver's license, the downfall was that when I got my license, I had to haul my sisters around, and my dad was busy. I had to do it, and that's what I didn't like. But if I got my license, I could go to the wrestling matches. I never had to ask, I just go. And so I never missed St. Paul. I never missed Minneapolis. And every once in a while, I'd hear about a card in Hastings. I live in Minnesota, folks that don't know that. Hastings, or I'd be in, Little Canada, wherever they had a card. And I could go to these small little shows. And so the bottom line is that in the St. Paul Minneapolis Auditorium in 1967 and 68, I'd go to the matches and I'd buy 10 programs or 15 programs. And they were only the 4-page pamphlets at the time. I think they were a dime or 15 cents. I don't remember, 15 cents. I'd buy 10 or 15 of them, and I'd bring a plastic bag, and I'd have them on my lap, and I'd protect them, and I'm sitting in the corner, a corner row right around ringside. I had the same seats. Marty O'Neill, our TV wrestling announcer, and he was the ring announcer at the cards. Short story on Marty O'Neill. He was a tremendous athlete in his day, wasn't a big guy. He went into radio. He played Little League baseball, and very, very athletic person. He went into radio, was the DJ, got into All-Star Wrestling way back in the 50s and stuck with it. So Marty's the ring announcer. Well, the more I'm at the matches, on a regular basis, I'm a regular face. And Marty would come down the aisle before the card would start, and he started to say, "Hey, young man, how are you?" Or "Hey there, guy, how you doing?" And "Hi, Marty," and that's all it would be. Well, this went on for a few months. Marty, during the intermission of one of the cards, he came over to me one time and he said, "I got to ask you a question. I noticed you buy a pile of programs. Why?" I wasn't even ready for the question, but I told him what I did. I said, "Well, I buy one and I save it for myself." And I said, then I send, I got somebody in St. Louis that sends me the St. Louis program, and somebody in Tampa, Florida will send me the Tampa, Florida, and so on. I went down, and he literally goes, "That's very interesting. I never thought anybody would think of something like that. I didn't realize people do that." And I said, "Well, that way, Marty, I know what's going on in all the other cities." In a way, I broke kayfabe there, because when Marty would come out on TV and tell the fans that somebody was injured, I might have a program that said, "In the main event this week, guess who's there?"
Right.
And that's the way it worked. And Marty then said to me, he says, "Hey, I'm driving down to Ortonville this week for a wrestling card." They were called spot shows in the day, these little gymnasium cards, smaller town, and they'd only have 3, maybe 4, but usually 3 matches on the card. And he says, "I'm driving down to Ortonville." I had no idea what Ortonville was. He could have told me we were driving to Alaska. I don't know. He says, "Would you like to ride along with me?" I'm like, "What?" "Yeah, sure." I told him. I go home and I said, "Dad, you're not going to believe this. Marty O'Neill asked me to go to a wrestling card with him." Well, lo and behold, I drove over to Marty's house on the Midway area of St. Paul, got in Marty's car, and we drove to Ortonville, southern Minnesota, small town. I don't know. I think it was maybe 80, 90 miles, 100 miles away. I don't remember. And we talked back and forth. Now, Marty never broke kayfabe, but he didn't treat me like an idiot either. And I'd make a comment, and one of them that stands out in my mind, we had Dr. X, the masked man, mystery man here at the time. And I made a comment to Marty. I said, "Marty, I'm always intrigued as to who this guy is under the mask, and I think he looks a lot like the Destroyer." And Marty goes, "Yeah, sometimes people just don't take the time to think it through." Never told me that he was, but it was the way he said that.
Right.
And that's who it was, of course. It was Dick Beyer, who was the Destroyer everywhere else. So that experience got me into kind of closer to the business, because Marty would say to me when I'd be around, there'd be a wrestler. Marty would, hey, this is my buddy George, something like that. It was so casual. And I got introduced to Red Bastien. Red Bastien was a babyface at the time, and Red, for whatever reason, he trusted me, I guess. And he was the very first wrestler that allowed me to go into the wrestler's locker room, dressing room. And here's where I really learned a valuable lesson. He said, come on in with me. And I'm 17, walk in, and as soon as that door opened and Red came in and they saw me, I swear to you, that proverbial, you can hear a pin drop, there was silence. Because there was an unknown in here, there was a foreigner. And I heard a couple of the kayfabe talk. I didn't understand what that was. Kayfabe language is kind of a carny language that's very similar to Pig Latin, if you know what that is. And I don't know kayfabe, so the carny language, but Red Bastien says, the boy's okay, don't worry. And that was the first time. And I got to know the guys, and they knew I wasn't going to spill the stories, or I wasn't going to spill that I saw two guys together that shouldn't be together because they're fighting each other. But it was still tough in school in those days, because when I was, I still had another year or two of school. And the kids in school, it was very interesting that if they didn't like wrestling or they didn't understand wrestling, they'd tell me, that stuff's fake, don't you, Shire? Well,
I love
I
that
just
conversation.
And it's true. I had it given to me. And I learned early on, Dan, that I can't debate with them, because they believe what they want to believe. And in my mind, yeah, I knew that things were not always right, but in my mind, it was, I know I still believe that some of it was real. And that was the whole mastery of it. That was part of the fun. And to somewhat believe a little bit, that suspension of disbelief, that's what made it interesting to go. But they made fun of me, so I didn't talk wrestling with them. And so that's where it started when I was younger. And then I got hooked up with Jim Melby, who was 2 years older than I was when I was 17. And Jim and I it was funny, our relationship started in the most unusual way. I was 17, he was 19. And he was starting to write stories for Norman Kietzer's Wrestling News magazine at the time. And Jim also was the one that brought, for Norman, he would bring the magazines to the Minneapolis or the St. Paul auditorium the night of a card to be sold. And Jim was the agent, sort of, for Norman, who lived in Mankato, Minnesota, another southern town. So I got to know Jim, and then him and I kind of did that together through the years. But here's how I met Jim. I went to one of the wrestling cards in late 1968, and there was for its day, it was state of the art. By today's standards, it would be crude in publishing style. But it was a magazine called Mat Mania. And inside the magazine, it was very interesting to me. There were stories and pictures of wrestlers from different territories. And more so than the newsstand magazines, in that there were pictures of stories of the wrestlers in the Midwest and the AWA. Well, the magazine was 50 cents. I bought it. I went home. I was paging through it, and I just thought, this is the coolest magazine. Well, there was a subscription form. So I took the subscription form, filled it out, sent in my $5. I remember I went to my dad and I said, Dad, can I have a check? I didn't have I was 17 years old. I didn't have a checking account. So I said, Dad, can I have a check for $5? And I want to make it out here. So I did. Sent off my subscription. Well, I went to another wrestling card after that. There was no Mat Mania magazines being sold. Several months went by. Never heard anything about my subscription. description. And I thought, God, this is weird. You know, and to me in that time frame, $5 was like, this guy just took life savings here, folks. So one day I go to the mailbox and I get this stapled at the top, bunch of pages, run off on one of these. I don't know if I remember when I was in school in the principal or in the secretary's office, they had this machine that would print stuff, and it was the
Ditto
purple
machine,
type,
Ditto machine, right?
whatever you called them. And it was very crude. Well, that's what this was, a pile of papers stapled, and it was called wrestling results. And I thought, well, they don't even spell wrestling right. It was spelled R-A-S-L-I-N with a, what's the punctuation above the S? Doesn't even know how to spell wrestling, should have two S's, I'm thinking. And I look through this, well, when I get to the first page, I'm getting the explanation that Matt Mania is no more, that Bert Ray, who was the Matt Mania editor, had decided to give it up, and Jim Melby was taking it over. And this was the new format. And it was small little 4 sections on each page of wrestling results. I was livid. I looked at this and I went, what?
Paid $5 for this.
Yes, it was horrible. And I noticed that Jim Melby lived in St. Paul, had his address on there. I didn't know him at all. I was so angry, his phone number was in there, and I mustered up enough courage to call him. No, holy cow. Remember this right, Shire. I wrote him a letter. Oh my God. For a 17-year-old, I wrote this scathing letter that I got this piece of garbage and I'm disappointed and you took my money and, you know, the whole thing. I think it was a week or so, 2 weeks later, my phone rang. Picked it up. I had a phone in my bedroom. I was lucky I had my own number because I had a paper route. So I had money to pay for my own phone, you know. So the phone rang. Hi, is George there? This is George. George, this is Jim Melby. And I remember I just went, oh no. Oh no. Because I was nasty. I wished I'd have saved the letter. I blasted him. Well, he told me who he was. He told me, he says, I'm really sorry that you didn't like the wrestling results. And he said, I'd be more than happy to give you your $5 back. He says, but I noticed you lived in St. Paul and I just wondered if you ever went to any of the cards or anything here. I said, yeah, I go all the time. And we talked. He became a fan in 1960. I became a fan in 59, was when the kitchen main event was going on between my parents. And we had similar stories. We found wrestling kind of the same way, you know. And so Jim says, well, if you'd ever want to, you know, go to the matches together or something, you know, let me know. And literally we talked on the phone for 2 hours. Well, long story short, Jim became literally one of my very, very best friends. And I started working with him to take the wrestling news to the auditoriums. Jim and I would drive down to Mankato for spot shows. We go to Redwood Falls, another southern town, spot shows. And then I started driving, you know, we'd go to Omaha, Nebraska for a card, and we'd drive to Indianapolis for a card. I mean, I had a license, had a car. Why wouldn't we do it, you know? So that was where that started. And then Norman had me do a couple of stories for Wrestling News. In those days, he didn't have you put your name on them. So you'd write a short story and it might just be a half a page thing or something. But I had many stories that I wrote that didn't have my name on them, so never got credit for it. But then I had a chance to do some Wrestling Review, Wrestling Monthly stories, actually got paid for them. And when I got out of high school, when I graduated, I wanted to technically go into radio or journalism. It was kind of a combination thing. I loved writing. So I never got a degree in journalism, but I took journalism classes at one of our local junior colleges. And then I went to broadcasting school. I graduated from that. I never went into radio because of the instability of the business. Mm-hmm. And wasn't long after that, a couple of years, I got married. Then we had a baby, bought a house. I can't just pack up and go to Timbuktu on a moment's notice at a buck station. And so I didn't go into radio. Ended up doing a little more studying, got my insurance licenses, went into banking and finance. And with insurance, it helped. And so that was my career. But I always stayed close to the wrestling, and I kept writing. And that's when I got to know the wrestlers. And they would tell me things. And irony falls back again because the wrestling results taught me that wrestling results are so cool. When I started really looking at them, I thought this is interesting because I could pick a wrestler and look at old wrestling results, maybe from the beginning of his career, and just follow him through. And it was, wow, in this town, he wrestled against this guy. And in this town, maybe 2 nights later, he was teamed with this guy. You know, in this town, he was billed under a different name at this time period. And he was a bad guy, but then all of a sudden over here, he was a good guy and he had a different name. And all of that with results came together for me. So I started going to libraries whenever I'd go to a town. If I went to Omaha, I went to the Omaha Library. And I'd go through old newspapers and look at Omaha results. I went to Lincoln, Nebraska, did the same thing. Wherever I'd go to their libraries. Started spending time in my local St. Paul libraries and always going through newspapers, coming up, and I'd pick a guy or a town that I knew they were in, and I'd search the newspapers. And that was the old-fashioned way to do it. You know, today people got it easy. They can Google something and it's on the internet. The only thing I warn people of all the time is that a lot of times that stuff is not accurate. You could rely on the newspaper clippings back in the day. But that's how I got involved in wrestling. It's just something that it just started eating me up. And so the long story short on it, guys, and then if you got a question or 200 you want to ask me, go ahead. But many years in my life, I learned how not to be a bad parent. I wanted to be a good dad. I wanted to be a good husband. And when I'd go to bed at night, that's all I'd pray to God to give me. Let me be a good dad. And if I die and the kids tell me I was a good dad, I was a success. My wife says I was a good husband, then I was a success. And I learned that because my mother was lousy. My dad, bless his heart, was a great man, but he just was never around. He gave me nothing to never went to anything at school, never was involved in anything I did or any of the other kids. And it taught me that I had to be involved with my kids. I wanted to go to their concerts. I wanted to go to their school events. I wanted to be there when they celebrated something, to their softball games or whatever it was. And I ended up with a great wife who understood my wrestling hobby, that I was nuts, and that every day I was involved with something, writing, researching, going to some convention, WFIA reunions and cauliflower alley clubs and you name it. And but the whole thing is that even with all those things, you know, there are times when life weighs on you. I had job issues, things that went wrong with work, dealing with people. And like everyone else, in the early years, you know, we had bills. We had times when, where do we get the money to pay this? And, you know, it all comes together. But I realized that I learned a lot from people that my dad never did it right. He filed bankruptcy 4 times. 4. Wow. And it was because he couldn't manage money. He just was awful. And at 17 years old, I'd be sitting down with him with a piece of paper, and I'd be writing down what his income was, what his bills were. And my God, Dad, you got money all over the place and you're not paying the bills. You know, and then I go into that type of a business. I went into the loan business, and that's what I did, managing and teaching, training, and for lending for 35 years. So kind of on the job training from my dad. So I learned from people that did the things wrong. And then I learned with wrestling, whenever my life was tough, whenever there were times when I'd come home from work and I'd just tell my wife, I'd say, I called it decomposing. I need to decompose. And I'd go up, take my suit and tie off, and just go to my wrestling room for half hour, come back out, and the world's in sync. And strangely enough, I tell you that it's like a drug. And I do that to this very day. When I have a tough time, just let me soak in wrestling. And I go into my room, I can pull out some files, or I can do some research, and I do it every day. I've now been retired from my job 15 years, and I've loved every minute of it. I did not leave my jobs hating them. I loved my work. I loved my training. I loved my lending. I loved the people. I loved management that I was in, but I loved retirement a lot better. And I have, I don't think there's been a single day that went by the last 15 years that I haven't done something involving wrestling. You know, sometimes today it's maybe spending time on some wrestling boards and, you know, writing something or doing something or sharing something, but I still do research. I still do life results records. I have a wrestling room in my house that has literally over 300 framed 8x10 glossy photos, posters, 11 by 14, whatever they are, some programs on the wall, ceiling to floor, wall to wall. There's no blank space in this room. And when you walk in, it's weird how I can always see something different for whatever reason. And a story pops in my head or something happens. And some of the joy in that was that the guys in the business, the wrestlers, they never saved a darn thing. The majority of them didn't. They didn't save a program from a town they were in. They didn't save their publicity photos. They didn't save the wrestling magazine that had them on the cover or a story in it. And so when they find somebody like me, and I mean, there are others out there like me that have these collections, but when they find somebody, they go, oh my God. And Nick Bockwinkel, here's the perfect person to explain this. Nick would come to my house, and the very first time he walked into my wrestling room, and he walked in and he stopped in the doorway, and you had to know Nick to appreciate Nick. He had this wry sense of humor, and he had a grin that he could give you. But he walked in the room and he stopped and he just looked, and his head kind of went around and, you know, up and down. And he just looks at me and he goes, "You're sick." And it was the greatest compliment in the world. It was. But then he told me, he said, "I applaud somebody like you for having all this stuff." He says, "because we never saved it." He said, I worked all these years and I don't have programs and I don't have pictures. And so we became friends. And so many times he would call me on the phone and he would say something to the effect of, did I ever wrestle or what year did I wrestle in this town, in this territory? And most of the time I'd rattle it off the top of my head. If I didn't, I could look it up real quick. I have 7 file cabinets in my room with programs from all over the country. And I have bios on all the wrestlers. I have individual files with pictures, bios, stories, clippings, things that I collect. I put it in their files. So I can go to any wrestler and pull it out. And so Nick would ask me those questions. And one that I have shared before, and it's funny, so I'll share it with you. He called me one time and he said, did I ever wrestle, trying to think of the towns, in Buffalo area, Buffalo, New York. Did I ever wrestle in Buffalo, New York? And I said, yeah, you did in 1961, but you weren't Nick Bockwinkel there. And I hear him on the other, and he goes, well, who the hell was I? I said, well, you wrestled as Roy Diamond. He says, oh, yeah, I remember. That was the promoter, Martinez, Pedro Martinez. He says, the guy was a crook. I said, oh, well, that's kind of strong, Nick. He goes, no. He said the guy, he was noted for not paying the boys or not giving you what he promised you. And he says, so I went into his town and I was supposed to go in there. And in those days, in 1960, 61, Nick was a babyface. He was about 6 years into the business, and he wrestled as, they always billed him as young Nicky Bockwinkel. And he'd be Warren Bockwinkel's kid. You know, they would tell this story in the programs. But he was young Nicky Bockwinkel. He says, yeah, I go in there and Martinez tells me he doesn't want me as Nick Bockwinkel. He says, if it's okay with you, Nick, I'm going to call you Roy Diamond. And Nick says, and I looked at him and I said, what? And he asked me if that was okay. And Nick says, I looked at him and I said, I don't care if you call me asshole, just pay me. And so I said to Nick, I said, Nick, that would be funny. I said, in this corner, ladies and gentlemen, at 232 pounds from St. Louis, Missouri, asshole. So we laughed about that. And I said, you know, you only worked for him for 4 cards as Roy Diamond. He says, I know, he didn't pay me. I left him. He says, the guy doesn't pay. So he was Roy Diamond for 4 matches, which is interesting when you look at history. So I took time out to put Nick Bockwinkel's life results record together. Now, here's the interesting thing, guys. We know wrestling is prearranged. We know results are predetermined. So somebody could say, well, then what difference does it make whether they won or they lost or got DQ'd or counted out? You know what? Again, the stories tell you, as you look at the results, they tell you how the feud progressed, why he lost, because they were building for another card, or why he got disqualified, or why the opponent was disqualified, or why someone interfered. You know, all of those results tell this. So I started making it my mission that I was going to do Nick's results record. And again, I'm going to libraries, I'm going to clippings, I'm going to my programs, I'm asking friends that knew him, send me if you got copies of clippings, whatever, and trying to compile this. So this is all research work. I mean, that wasn't, you know, like I said, it wasn't the days where you could Google something and, oh, there it is. So I got all these results together. And the one thing I will tell you is that every results record I've ever done subsequent to this, they're never all complete, because there's always another result out there. There's always, oh my God, I just found 3 results I didn't realize. And I verify them to make sure that it's the right time period, that it was there, that he wasn't anywhere else, you know, if that happens. But they're never complete. But I had put Nick's record together. And at the time, I would say it was about, I want to say 85 to 90% of all of his matches throughout his career, it would have been up to 1988 when he pretty much left the business. And I had a chance to have a copy made, and I wanted to give it to Nick. And so, again, I have this blank piece of paper that I use as example, but I got together with Nick. It was at a reunion here in the Twin Cities. And I asked him, I says, Nick, would you do me a favor? I said, would you sign my copy of the record I just gave you? Sure. So he takes the pen and he starts to write down there, and he stops and he looks up at me and he says, how do you spell statistician? And I looked at him and I said, Nick, you're the one with the big words on the interviews. Right. I don't know.
Right.
So he just looks at me and he continues to scribble. And it's to George, my favorite statistician, is what he was writing. And then he signed Nick Bockwinkel. Well, I wish I had it here now. I have the copy, and I tell you, statistician is all messed up. But that's what makes it special. because I said, Nick, you just made this a collectible. And because Nick would come out on his interviews and he'd use these big words
Oh yeah.
that, you know, he had you running out to get the dictionary to look them up as he's talking. And he did this on purpose just to, you know, be sophisticated. So that's why that was special. And one of the things that happened to me when I was 2 months away from graduating from high school, we had the wrestling office was going to run a card in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, where I lived. And it was at my high school. The Cottage Grove Police Reserve were doing it as a fundraiser. And they knew that I liked wrestling. So they asked me if I would go to the wrestling office with one of the officers and if we could try to work out getting a wrestling card. Sure. So I go in. I knew at that time Bill Casisto, who was what they called the matchmaker for the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club. And I knew Wally Carbo. But I dealt with Bill Casisto that day. We walked in, and again, I'm a 18-year-old kid. Walked in, but Bill knew me, and I said, we want to kind of talk about doing a wrestling card. And okay, got some dates. We got a date together. We were going to hold the card. This was actually, we went there in February of 1970. And 2 months later in April was when the card was going to be. So 2 months before I graduated. He asked me, Bill Casisto, he says, have you got any idea, you know, any wrestlers that you're looking that you'd like to have on the card if it can be worked out? Well, we had just come off of a big feud in the Minneapolis and St. Paul auditoriums, the big arenas. Pepper Gomez had been feuding with Dr. X. And they had now kind of stopped the feud and Doc had moved on. But I said to him, I said, well, would we be able to get Dr. X on the card? And I said, it'd be great if we could have Gomez. He says, well, we'll see what we can do. We'll check the calendars. I think we probably worked that out for you. Okay. So I felt really good. You know, I kind of just suggested a main event here. And then as we got closer to the date, my card was going to be, I always have to remember this. It was going to be Gomez versus Dr. X. And it was going to be Blackjack Lanza versus Bob Windham. And the opening match, remember they only had three matches on a spot show. The opening match was going to be Kenny J versus a guy named Lee Matson. And Lee was a veteran wrestler who was kind of in the downside of his career. So basically we had two low-level wrestlers in the in the match. So we get to the night of the matches. We're in my gymnasium. I get to be the ring announcer. That was cool. That was going to be the first time I was going to be a ring announcer. And I was excited. And I know I have this vengeance side in me. There were kids in school that always laughed at me. I told you when I followed, you know that stuff is fake. Well, there were a few of them that were in the gymnasium that night, and I took delight in knowing that I was the ring announcer, and they were just a fan, you know, or whatever. But here's the deal. We get about 15 minutes before the card, and things are going well. I'm sitting at the table by ringside, and somebody come out. I have no idea who it was. He says, they want to see you in the locker room. Okay. So I go back to our gymnasium. It's my high school. Go back in there. And they had, you're familiar with the way the lockers were. They'd have a bench and then another bench. They were in an L shape.
Right.
Well, I go in there. Here's Dr. X with his mask sitting on one bench. And then on the L side, right in front of him is Pepper Gomez. Well, break kayfabe, folks, you know. I said, okay, you know, I had not met Dr. X before this. I had never talked to the guy. But he evidently was the one that was in charge at the show, kind of the guy in charge. He says to me, well, we got a problem. And he's talking in his normal Dick Beyer voice. He's got a voice that was just, you could pick him out of a crowd anywhere. He said, we got a problem. He says, Gomez here can't wrestle. He's got an inner ear infection. and his equilibrium is off. Now here's the deal. Gomez was there. So I took it upon myself to mentally think, all right, I'm going to take this as being real because Gomez really is here and he's just not feeling well. And so Doc says to me, so he's not going to be able to wrestle. And I'm kind of like, okay. He goes, well, that's not the only problem. He says, Lanza's stuck in Chicago. He's not going to be here. Now that one I picked out right away. I said, okay, this is the typical he missed his plane connections from Chicago. They used to pull that all the time, you know. But then I thought, oh my God, okay, Lanza's not going to be here. Then Doc come up with he just kept talking. He come up with the perfect plan. He says, so here's what we're going to do. Now I got to make sure I get this right. He says, we're going to have, oh boy, we're going to have X and Wyndham. He says, we're going to have me and Wyndham versus Jay and Madsen in the main event. It'll be a tag team match. And then we'd have two preliminary matches. Wyndham would go against Jay and X would go against Madsen. That was the way he wanted it out. Well, I thought about that, and I swear to you, I don't know where I got the guts, but I looked at him and I said, could we do it a different way? And Doc says, I don't care. What do you want to do? I said, well, could we put you, meaning Dr. X, could we put you and Madsen against Jay and Wyndham? And he looks at me and he's looking through the mask. He goes, yeah, we can do that. I said, and the reason I want to do that is because that way we've got a main event guy on each side, meaning Wyndham and Doc. Okay, that's what we're going to do. So that was the card. So I walk out. Now we're right at 8 o'clock. The card was supposed to start. I got to go into the ring. And I remember I had to announce to the crowd that Pepper Gomez wasn't going to be there and that we were going to adjust the crowd. They booed me. I had like 1,200, 1,500 people booing me. I felt like I
got heat.
I did. I got heat. And so I immediately said, hey, I'm only the messenger here. I said, we've got a good card. It's going to work. And I told them what we were going to do. Well, I don't know that it sounded good on paper to some of these folks, but I will tell you this. The card went off without a hitch. The tag team match, I swear to you, Wyndham and Doc and Jay and Madsen, they made that match so good. They worked hard. And Doc and Wyndham, I mean, I just sat back and I thought, I was happy. I said, I made this match. I just promoted my first card. And I was happy with it. Well, after the card was over, I went back and I was able to thank Doc and Wyndham. And I told him, I said, guys, I loved you put on a great match, and thank you so much. And Doc, he thanked me. He said, no, thank you. He says, we wanted to, you know, this wasn't going to go off like you wanted it to, and we wanted to make it work. So that was my night as a promoter. But it also started really the rest of my life friendship with Dr. X, Dick Beyer. And he was far and above my favorite wrestler of any that I've ever seen in my life. People say, well, who's your favorite wrestler? I've got tons of favorite wrestlers, but Dr. X is number one, period. I loved the gimmick, the mask. I loved his interviews. I loved the way he worked. As a baby or a heel, he was great as Dr. X. And so that's how that all started. So I need to take a drink of water and ask a question.
I was actually just about to say, George, we're over an hour already. I mean, that's a hell of that's a hell of a story that you just told, where you went from your start in school and kid to back to the high school. Really, I love those kind of what is that, Benny? Sort of come home again.
Full circle, yeah.
Full circle, yeah. I went back to the high school again in 1972. The Minneapolis Wrestling Club promoted another card, and I got to be the announcer for it.
Oh, nice.
And it was the main event was Ramon Torres, who had just come into the territory and was getting a decent push. He had beaten Larry Hennig on a TV match for his debut to kind of build him up.
Right.
And so our match at the school gymnasium was going to, the main event was Hennig versus Torres. And I had a chance to meet Larry Hennig that night. And then I had a chance to meet Ramon Torres. And fan clubs were a big thing back then for wrestlers. And I was talking with Torres, and he had just come off of a year earlier, his brother Alberto had died after a match in Omaha. And Ramon and I were talking about that, and I ended up starting a fan club for him, for Ramon Torres. So that got me into the magazines, and then eventually I was doing fan club columns. And so it all evolved where eventually I was around the business enough where the guys knew me and they learned to accept me. And so many of them became my friends. And, Larry Hennig, I remember I was with him about a week before he died. I was with him all day at an event here in Robbinsdale. And a couple of days later, he called me after the event and he thanked me on the phone. He thanked me. He said, I wanted to thank you for putting me over at this event. He said, and for always being there for me and the boys. I got off the phone and I told my wife, I said, that was Larry that just called to thank me. I mean, it was, I don't get paid for this stuff, but that meant more than money could give me. Well, sadly, that was the last time I talked with him because it was just like a few days later, he passed away. And that really hurt. I mean, I was blessed that he had called me, and it was almost like I thought later, maybe he knew and he was just, but anyway. So, those friendships. Dr. X was at my house. Oh man, sitting at my desk talking about different wrestlers and telling me stories. Nick Bockwinkel had his 60th birthday party at one of the local country clubs here in Minnesota. And, this goes back to '94, but he had his 60th birthday party. And of all the wrestlers and the friends that he invited to this country club, I was there. And he said later, you earned the right to be here.
Nice.
I think that says it all.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Well, George, as we wrap up for the night. Sorry, I'm trying to the echo.
I don't hear it.
As we wrap up for the night, we're going to get to your book, but Benny, you haven't really had a chance to say anything tonight. Final thought to you?
Well, and George kind of touched on it at the very end, but that he became, from a fan to an actual part of the business, and he formed these lifelong friendships with men like Bockwinkel and Dick Beyer, and I believe he also had a very close friendship with Kenny J. And it's just that's really what this is all about, the bonds that were formed.
Benny, the interesting thing is that back in 2000, when I was going to the Cauliflower Alley reunions, Dick Beyer, Red Bastien, and Nick Bockwinkel told me that I had to be they wanted me on the board of directors of Cauliflower Alley Club. And they said I had earned a right to be there. Now, this isn't bragging, but this is a moment when you say, you know what, I'm humbled. And I went into the room for the first board meeting, and at that point in time, I'm sitting at a round table with Bockwinkel, Beyer, Bastien, Penny Banner, lady wrestler, Killer Kowalski.
Wow.
There was a former wrestler, Tom Drake, was there. Dean Silverstone, who was a promoter in the Pacific Northwest. Carl Lauer, who had been a promoter for years. And there were a couple of others. And I'm in awe that I'm like, holy cow, I'm the only fan here. And again, they told me that I earned the right. And so this is something where I tell you, I haven't made a lot of money doing my wrestling research over the years and everything. That has never been the motivation. But 10 years ago, when the Cauliflower Alley was going to recognize me with the Jim Melby Historian Award, Jim passed away in 2007, and I was on the board, and we talked about doing a historian award in his honor, because he was like the king of the historians, and he had taught so many of us about results and research. I never intended that I would get this award. But we got to 2013 and they called me and they wanted me to have the award because they said I deserved it as well. So I'm at the Gulf Coast reunion a month before, and Dick Beyer is there. And I went up to Dick and I said, Dick, I was wondering if you'd do a favor for me. I said, next month I'm going to get the historian award at Cauliflower. He says, yeah, I know. And he's got this grin on his face. And I said, well, I was wondering if you would maybe do the honors and be the presenter for me, because we got to choose our presenter in those days. On the table, my hand is sitting like this. Dick took his hand and he put it on mine and he says, it'd be my honor to do that for you. That was bigger to me than the award. I mean, I was like, oh my God. And that had come full circle because, as I said, Dick was one of the first guys that I really got to know in 1970. And so 2 months later at Cauliflower, he got up at the lectern and he put me over, made me sound like the second coming of the Lord, to the wrestling business. And I am forever grateful to him. And so, yeah, those are the things that makes it worth it to be a fan, but more so to be trusted and to know that I had that little bit of inside, and I had other adventures in wrestling. I mean, I had a chance to be a heel manager for an independent group and so on,
That'll definitely be a story for part two. George, before we let you go, George Shire, Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors. Amazon, anywhere books are sold, as well as the AWA record books. Do you have any social media or anything else you'd like to plug before we wrap up tonight?
Well, let me say this about the books. Amazon, yes, for all of them. The AWA record books, my personal stash of those is limited, and I'm not ordering any more. So they're going to be faded out eventually. But the Minnesota's Golden Age at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, if you like. Go to my wrestling Facebook page, George Shire's Wrestling Time Machine, and hit join, and you can get all kinds of old nostalgia. But send me a private message if by chance you are interested in getting a copy of Minnesota's Golden Age and you do want it signed. Some people like to have me prove that I can write, so I'd be happy to do it. We can work out a deal directly, but best way is usually Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of your bookstores. They can order it for you.
Sounds good. So George Shire, again, thank you so much for being here. For the original Long Island Iced Tea, Benny Scala, I'm Dan Sebastian. We've had a great night. We will see you all next time we're in the ring.